I loved the history part of this paper so much, and the story you told is so important. And I wish there wasn't a word about constitutional interpretation in the piece, because I don't think there is any, I really don't think there's any reasonable argument that either living constitutionalism, originalism, anything in between, or merging of those two doctrines has anything to do with what happened between 1868 and I'll say 1936. Um, I think what tells that story more than anything is something that Justice Bradley wrote. He wrote the civil rights cases, what Justice Bradley wrote in his diary. And I quote, this is from Justice Bradley in his diary: depriving white people of the right of choosing their own company would be to introduce another kind of slavery. That's what he wrote. Whatever conditions led to the disastrous history you recount, I am reasonably confident has nothing to do with either constitutional interpretation or any alleged differences between originalism and living constitutionalism. I have one more comment, then I'll ask my question. You're worried about it. You wanted to entrench what I assume you think is the original meaning of the 14th Amendment. And with respect to Michael, who's in the room, and others, I'm still reasonably confident that the original meaning of the 14th Amendment allowed segregated schools. If we're going to entrench that idea, then I think we'd have to say that Brown is wrong. So I think the 14th Amendment came to us with a lot of ambiguity and a lot of uncertainty, and a lot of bad things as well as a lot of good things. And so I guess my question that I'd like you to answer is, how do we, well, you might disagree with the premise. It seems to me we have to get people to realize that the difference between good and bad constitutional outcomes has to do with politics, not interpretation. So I'm curious why you, in this paper at least, privilege interpretation over politics, when my reading of history tells me it was all about politics and almost nothing about interpretation. But I loved the history part of the paper and thought it was great.
Hey, Kurt. Kurt, could you unmute? You need to unmute yourself, Kurt.
There we go. Sorry. Good morning, everybody. Great to be on the second day of the conference. Ernie, I loved the paper. I liked the exploration of this period of time. The discussion of what happened is a critically important issue, and I welcome your entry into it. My question focuses though on where you started your comments this morning. You're telling a journey, a story about a journey, but that makes it really important to talk about where the journey starts, and you concede that point as of critical importance to your story. But how you present the beginning point was kind of unclear to me. I mean, on the one hand, you accept William Nelson's and Eric Foner's basic proposition that the terms of the 14th Amendment were open-ended, they had no fixed meaning. But on the other hand, you quote Foner, and then you kind of echo his statement later on, where you accept his basic claim that the 14th Amendment had, quote, a core purpose of freedom and equality for Black Americans, and that core purpose, of course, is later abandoned or dies or compromised in the next period. But I wondered whether or not those broad concepts really should be viewed as the key starting points for the 14th Amendment, because when you make that claim that the core purpose of the 14th Amendment was freedom and equality for Black Americans, you seem to be reading the amendment as embracing the principles of radical Republicans and their hopes for the Reconstruction amendments. But I'm not really sure why we should view the principles and the goals of the radical Republicans as establishing the key original meaning of the Reconstruction amendments that then die in the later period. Because radical Republicans themselves were extremely frustrated with the Reconstruction amendments. They criticized the language of the 13th Amendment as being insufficiently radical. They criticized Section 2 and Section 3 of the 14th Amendment as being insufficiently radical. They criticized the 15th Amendment. They were bitterly opposed and disappointed with the 15th Amendment as not only being insufficiently radical, it was the most conservative option that was put on the table for the 15th Amendment. So why should the disappointed radical Republican principles of broad equality writ large for Black Americans be the central organizing principle behind the 14th Amendment? Couldn't we, and perhaps maybe shouldn't we, view the amendment from the perspective of the moderate Republicans? From the moderate perspective, you would view the 14th Amendment as an important advance in freedom, liberty, and equality, but only as a partial advance. You got something, but in that advancement, they still preserve the basic federalist structure of the Constitution and left states free to do a lot of stuff. So from that perspective, the lost years of the 14th Amendment don't represent dying constitutionalism, but instead they represent a dying political a commitment to only partially constitutionalized principles of freedom and equality.
Okay, Jason, you're next.
Great, and good morning, Ernie. It's good to see you. This actually follows on from Kurt's question, and I also want to ask you about what you describe as the arc that you're describing and your relevant starting point. And could I ask you to think about the fact that the Reconstruction amendments are amendments, however transformative they are attached to the pre-existing document. So the question for you is whether there is any sense in which the original Constitution renders impossible or difficult the success in the way you define it of the 14th Amendment. So for example, as Kurt just said, federalism is preserved. The jurisdictional boundaries of the existing states are preserved. Congress gets a Section 5 power, but the 10th Amendment is still in place. The executive branch is retained, unaltered. The federal courts get some additional jurisdiction, but they're still limited. There's no sweeping away of all of the prior decisions of the Supreme Court. So in retrospect, was it a mistake to amend rather than replace from the account of your story? And then as to, because I am, and this is sort of contra Eric's comment, I am very much interested in text and the text of the amendments. If you knew nothing about Reconstruction and you sought to understand it from the three amendments, you'd see the 13th eliminated slavery. The 15th prohibited denying voting to newly freed slaves or otherwise on the basis of race. But the middle one, the 14th, says nothing about race. So the conclusion might be that as to race, it's just those two things in the 13th and the 15th, and that is as far as Reconstruction on race goes. If the 14th Amendment had been much more race specific or even race specific, then what? A different account. And in this respect, I was thinking about a slaughterhouse, which we remember for its sort of privileges and immunities idea, either error or success, depending on your perspective. But there's a lot more in the slaughterhouse case that I think is interesting. And one is its extensive discussion of equal protection and due process. And so there, slaughterhouse says, sort of rejecting the claims of the butchers, it says that it understands the 14th Amendment due process and equal protection as a response to the existence of laws in the states where the newly emancipated Negroes reside, which discriminated with gross injustice and hardship against them as a class, that was the evil to be remedied by this clause. Now, of course, it doesn't reflect the text of the 14th Amendment, but also that sort of core idea reflected in this case, once it gets perhaps diluted by a much broader jurisprudence built around equal protection and due process, which of course by their text reach beyond questions of race. Is that also maybe something of a misstep within the 14th Amendment itself, given, as you say, sort of the hindsight consequences for race discrimination particularly?
Okay, Ernest, would you like to respond to those questions?
Sure. So I think one thing I want to be clear about is that I'm not making a causal claim that the people who pushed the 14th Amendment in a bad direction were living constitutionalism because they had that constitutional theory of interpretation. That's what took us to hell in a handbasket. What I'm trying to say is the things that happened historically all fall into categories that living constitutional theory tends to accept as legitimate forms of constitutional change, as things that you can derive meaning from, and that then exert pressure on future interpretations of the Constitution. And so, and part of what I've come to realize about living constitutionalism, or at least what I think about living constitutionalism after immersing myself in this history, is that living constitutionalism plays two roles, right? It is sometimes proffered as an alternative interpretive theory to originalism. But I think if you look at the way somebody like Mike Klarman interprets the role of social forces in constitutional change, it also just describes a range of pressures operating not only on courts, but any other constitutional interpreters out there, the president or Congress, that pushes constitutional meaning, whatever interpretive theory you are trying to employ. And so that's the role that I think it's playing. And so politics, of course, permeates a lot of this, but living constitutionalism is about the paths by which politics comes into constitutional law and shapes constitutional meaning, and that's what I'm talking about. Now, Eric asked a question about Brown, and another thing I want to make clear is that I don't think that the Reconstruction settlement was necessarily an adequate interpretation of these amendments, right? I am a living constitutionalist. I think that they can evolve. And so if we can't justify Brown under the original understanding, we may be, we can talk about, ways in which that meaning needs to evolve as education becomes more important and things like that. Although I think, I am fairly persuaded by Michael McConnell's account there. Now, Kurt, you wanted to talk about where the journey starts. What is the beginning point? And one question that I would love to have some guidance on is, I do think living constitutionalists have to have a start point, but I'm not sure that it has to be identified with as much precision if we're just trying to figure out where does the story start and which direction is it going in, right? Because the central problem that I have is, was there constitutional erosion that we have to worry about entrenchment, or is this really just a story about the pace of reform once the Constitution sets where we're going? That's the older narrative that I'm trying to challenge. I think it's fair to say, I agree that we need to look at the moderates and try to cast our net as broadly as possible in figuring out what the framers of the 14th Amendment meant. I think that's well captured in this notion that we want to entrench in the Constitution the basic results of the war. And so that result of the war includes the overthrow of the Southern caste system and slavery and all of its accompanying things. And so if you have 10 years later and the planters are back in charge and the Black people are back out in the fields and don't have the freedom to leave, then we know something has gone wrong, even if we don't have agreement on the specifics of exactly what the text of the 14th, 13th, and 15th Amendment meant. And then Jason's question, was it a mistake not to start over? And I think there is no doubt that other constitutional principles, some of which I hold particularly dear, like federalism, got in the way of affecting the sort of change that the Reconstruction amendments needed to affect. And that's why I had not realized that the war did not officially end until 1871, when the representatives from Georgia were seated. We kept the South under the war power so that we could do these things. And the utility of that was precisely that it suspended these other constitutional concerns. And I guess I think that was the right thing to do, and we probably should have done it a lot longer. But I think constitutional law has to make these trade-offs. I think there are benefits to structural protections of liberties too, and so you try to find a way to achieve the reform that you're making with doing at least the least possible damage to the rest of it. And I think probably the best thing to have done would have been to have a lot more troops in the South considerably longer until you got there, but do it under the war power so that you can go back to a system that had served you pretty well up to then, especially for the North, in the sense that federalism allowed them to resist the slave power throughout the antebellum period. And that had been really important in marshaling opposition to slavery. So I think that's a very complicated problem that they had a good legal solution to, they just didn't pursue it long enough. And then the question, Jason's further question about, should we have done more in the 14th Amendment, made it more explicitly about race? I'm going to retreat again to the notion that these amendments were about constitutionalizing the fruits of the war. And I think that is sufficient to get us, considerably more reform than in fact we got, which makes it possible for us to talk about the failure of entrenchment. Even on this minimal, thin meaning of the 14th Amendment, we went in reverse. And that's the phenomenon that I'm trying to address.
Okay, thanks. Jamal, did you have any input there? Or?
Nope.
Okay, so our next threesome, with 5 still waiting after that, and just for your information, will be Mitch Berman, John McGinnis, and Mike Ramsey.
Okay. Ernie, good to see you. Thanks so much for the paper. Thanks for your comments, Jamal. I don't have that much to say in addition to Jamal's point. I just want to sort of forcibly associate myself with his thought that your description, Ernie, of what living constitutionalism is about and sort of its positive embrace of change and the tight connection between progressivism and living constitutionalism is not how I'd see it. Now, you responded to him by saying, yeah, I hear what you're saying, Jamal, but that's sort of how I read the literature. I haven't seen people who have been pushing back that much. I take that to be the center of gravity of the literature. Here, I'm trying to paraphrase what you said, and I hope faithfully. So I don't know that I'm sure my individual comments aren't going to push you back on that, but maybe if you just hear from more self-described non-originalists and living constitutionalists singing the Jamal line, it may have a cumulative effect. So now just speaking for my own views, I'd like to see the full book, of course, engage with them. Obviously, I'd like to see everyone's full book engage with them and applaud them, but I'll take it if just yours does, and even if it shits on my view, only because it's a view which is a view of law. So it's not a should, it's not this is what we should do, this is not a good story. It really takes off from Scalia's view, which says we should be investigating what the law is. And then he goes and says, well, the law is just the original public meaning of the text. And I took that view to be absurd even before Dick's lovely paper from yesterday. So it's just an incredible view about what the law is. But I think he was right to say, one thing we should have a theory of is what constitutes or determines the content of our law. So I'm with Will and Steve on the positive turn. I conceptualize it somewhat differently and I have a different answer. But that I think is a strong plank, even if perhaps a minority one, of contemporary non-originalism or living constitutionalism, which is trying to figure out what the law is. And then the thought is that the fundamentals of the law are grounded in social practices. Law, like all other social phenomena, is metaphysically grounded in the social, and the social is by its very nature inescapably dynamic. And you add up those two things and you get living constitutionalism. So there's no ought here. It's not what we should do. It's not wouldn't it be better if we had more entrenchment, or wouldn't it be better if we had less entrenchment? I might be with you, actually, believe it or not, in sharing some of your Burkean sympathies here. So I might think it'd be better that way, but it's just a claim about what the law is. And I think then, given the way the organic works, it is baked into the nature of this account of law that there is going to be a very substantial degree of entrenchment. That's because law, the fundamental legal elements, which in my view are legal principles, are directly grounded in social facts. And in a large polity, those social facts move slowly generally. There can be moments of punctuation when they move pretty quickly, but it's the nature of societies that they're sort of like aircraft carriers. So they move slowly. So you get your entrenchment built in, not as an affirmative claim, a volitional claim within the theory, or this is how we should do things. It's just if the descriptive or conceptual or metaphysical claim is broadly right, then it's going to deliver you a non-trivial degree of entrenchment. The last thing I'll say is just on your external-internal distinction, that didn't really ring true to me for what it's worth. I thought really where you were tracing was a Dworkinian, anti-Dworkinian distinction. So the Dworkinian living constitutionalists think everything is driven by morality, and you can spin that internal, external. As you know, Dworkin wouldn't have accepted that characterization. But really what you've latched onto is that people like Sager and Fleming are Dworkinians, so they've got a particular view. But the rest of the living constitutionalists, including those who lean more jurisprudential, are positivist and basically Hartian. So again, Dick Fallon is an example here. So I just think that really what's going on is not this move, a recent move that you describe at 26 to 27, on non-originalism or living constitutionalism had been internal, and then the originalists pushed back, and in response, the living constitutionalists look for something external. That's not the way I would tell the story. I would just think that really has mostly been external throughout, but it's been complicated and hasn't been all that jurisprudentially sophisticated. So my question is, what do you think about that? Thanks for your attention.
John McGinnis.
Well, I very much enjoyed this paper. Let me make 2 points. First, I would welcome a little more discussion of exactly what is ambiguous about the 14th Amendment, because I think some originalists would concede that there's some difficult questions, but there are some relatively easy questions that would have had a big effect if, for instance, the decision to get rid of grandfather laws and to that tried to disenfranchise African Americans, that would have had a very positive effect and was within the core meaning of the 15th Amendment. So I would think that would be an interesting line to draw. But I think what's important about your paper is actually the important insight that constitutionalism depends on culture. And so I would want you to reflect a bit, perhaps more on that, because one possible culture is just the culture of originalism, which of course is what we're engaged in at the moment. Culture of originalism is very important if one believes that political impulses tend to erode entrenchments, regardless of whether originalism is in some sense ultimately true or what brand of it is true. The sense that we have a culture of originalism is going to fight back against that. But is that enough? I think that's another hard question. What makes a culture of fidelity, a fidelity to the entrenchments we have? There's a very interesting new book by Dennis Rasmussen suggesting that, and this is my interpretation of the book, that all the founders of the Constitution, really except Madison, came to despair about the culture in which the Constitution was, and they thought that would erode the Constitution. They thought the partisanship would erode it, or the absence of religion would erode, or the absence of localism and fellow feeling would erode it. So what is the culture? You ended your remarks about that. What do we need to have a culture, the kind of culture of fidelity that at least protects the kind of entrenchments that you think are so crucial, and I agree are so crucial to constitutionalism?
Okay, and Mike Ramsey.
Well, Ernie, thanks very much for this, and it's great to have you involved in this conference. And I enjoyed this paper a lot, and it's very consistent with sort of my intuition about what happened after the 14th Amendment, although I'm not a scholar in that area, so it's really just an intuition. But I did want to press you a little bit, and I think this is consistent with the remarks of Eric and Kurt, at least, and maybe some others, though perhaps from a little bit different perspective. But in telling a story about how the 14th Amendment had certain guarantees that were then lost in your evolutionary process that you described, don't you necessarily have to make pretty strong claims, actually, about the original meaning of the 14th Amendment? And I think that rhetorically, at least, you do. So just a couple of examples. You say in the introduction, you say a constitution that the framers of the 14th Amendment understood to guarantee freedom, security, and equality for Black Americans was reinterpreted in ways that gutted its guarantees, and you cite Plessy there. And then later you quote the historian Woodward, for the conclusion that the radicals committed to the country to a guarantee of equality and that popular convictions were not prepared to sustain. That legal commitments overreached moral persuasion. Legal commitments that were there overreached moral persuasion. And then finally, that on page 26, you say that it was not only a failure to keep faith with the 14th Amendment, but also to a change in that amendment's meaning as it was understood and implemented in American law. So it seems like to me that all of this depends upon a view of a fairly thick understanding of what the 14th Amendment guaranteed, at least with respect to some basic propositions like segregation, that is in tension with quite considerably the view of the 14th Amendment, for example, that Richard Fallon gave us channeling Eric Foner yesterday. So I think you have a rhetorical appeal to this, but I'm not sure that at all that you've established it. And that there's a story that could be told quite to the contrary, that at least the sort of the minimal consensus of the 14th Amendment was much, much narrower than what you were suggesting. And it didn't contain much more than sort of very basic rights. And that the subsequent cases, such as Plessy, were actually consistent with the original meaning of the 14th Amendment. And that's an argument that's been made by quite a lot of people. It's not an argument that seems right to me, but I'm not a scholar of this area. And my main point, though, is not to take issue with or not take a position on that, but rather to say, don't you necessarily have to take a position on that? And don't you need to make a stronger case than at least what we're seeing in this part of the book to be, that there was a fairly thick, broadly understood meaning of the 14th Amendment that guaranteed the kind of rights that you were talking about, that was then lost by the bad interpretations, by the wrong interpretations of the post-Reconstruction Supreme Court.
Okay, before turning the time over to Ernest to respond to those three questions, I just want to observe that we have 20 minutes left and 16 questioners. We're not going to get through all 16 for sure, but I want to admonish the remaining questioners to try to pick your most important questions or points to present those. Okay, having said that, Ernest, I'd like to respond to those questions.
So I'm going to try to be fast, but if you don't get in, please do send me your questions by email, because this is a very formative stage and I would really appreciate it. So starting with Mitch, first of all, love the beard, buddy. So it's possible that there is a disconnect between academic culture of living constitutionalism and culture outside of academia. Certainly what I see when people talking about living constitutionalism outside of academia is not this kind of careful balance, but just enthusiasm about progress. But I think I see it in academia too. So when Jack Balkin writes about social movements, he doesn't talk about the bad ones and how we tell the difference. Larry Kramer writes about popular constitutionalism. He doesn't talk about good mobs and bad mobs. When David Strauss writes the text out of the Constitution, right, and says that the future developments are all that matters. He's not worrying about whether we should hold on to the text as some agreed upon minimum. And I think if we had a more developed theory of entrenchment, we would be talking more about those kinds of things. I take the point about external, internal. Is there a good way to say that without using a proper noun, right? Without just talking about Dworkin. So maybe positivist, anti-positivist, let me know what you think, Mitch. John, so what's ambiguous about the 14th Amendment? I think I just want to rest on the empirical fact of disagreement, right? Equal protection, due process, privileged immunities, these are constantly debated. And so I don't want to take strong positions on meaning, or else I have to write Evan's paper on equal protection and Larry's paper on due process, all in the in the course of writing a book that's supposed to be about change, not interpretation. And I guess the question I have for the group is whether that's even possible, or whether you have to write the book about meaning in order to write the book about change. Now, if I had to answer the question about what gets you a change in the culture, if I had a good answer to that, I'd be done, right? And that's obviously the hardest thing. I think what I'm trying to say is what C. Van Woodward said about what the South had to teach America generally, which was a sense of tragedy. He emphasized that the South is the only part of the country at that point that had lost war, and that there was a certain humility and sense that things could go badly, a sense of self-questioning that had come from that would do the whole country good as they contemplated, for instance, whether it was a good idea to go into Vietnam. And so I'm trying to say that if this story were more prominent in our constitutional culture, then I think we would have more of a sense of caution. I think we would worry more about entrenchment, and that would be a good thing. But that's all I have to offer at this point. Obviously, there's a lot of work to be done. And then still, so Mike, I think freedom, security, equality doesn't seem like a strong claim to me. I'm not making strong claims about what exactly those terms mean, but it does seem to me that things got so bad that on any definition of those words, on any characterization of what it means to constitutionalize the fruits of the war, we have failed to do that. And that opens the door to talk about constitutional change. That's it.
Okay, thank you. I don't see Jamal now. He's moved off onto my screen, I guess.
I'm going to just let people comment. So.
Would you like to comment, Jamal?
No, I'll just let people question.
Oh, okay, great. So our next threesome is Nick Perillo, Dick Fallon, and Mike Rappaport.
Thanks. Similar to John McGinnis's comments, I urge you to further develop the very important point that we pay too much attention to methodology and not enough attention to culture. As you say, narrative is part of how culture is constructed, but I'd be very interested to hear you develop further, the other ways in which a culture of entrenchment or fidelity, as John said, could be better constructed. I mean, it seems to me that the porousness of the American judiciary to the surrounding political environment is really hardwired in many ways. I mean, the people we appoint to the bench are, people who have connections of some kind with recently elected politicians. We appoint people who have succeeded. We appoint people in middle age, who have already succeeded in the adversary system with its premium on ingenuity and all that kind of thing. So I just be very interested to hear you explore that more.
Okay, Dick.
Thanks, Ernie. I have two friendly suggestions, very brief, and my question, to the extent that there is one, is whether you take these to be helpful suggestions or somehow contrary to your project. The first suggestion would be that the setup is bad, in the sense that you set up the paper or the chapter as if this is living constitutionalism against originalism. And then, being so unfriendly to living constitutionalism, it comes as a surprise when you declare yourself as a living constitutionalist at the end. So here's the constructive suggestion that grows out of that. Recognize from the beginning that there are multiple versions of living constitutionalism. And that the various people you talk about as representatives of it are different, and that there's room under the tent for more people, because you're actually going to want to get under the tent yourself later on. I think that would be less confusing to your readers. The second suggestion, which I can make very quickly, would be to say that most, if not all, versions of living constitutionalism, at least implicitly, if not explicitly, have positive and normative dimensions. That is, most living constitutionalists aren't trying to say that this is the ideal way to have a constitution operate everywhere for every country in the world. We've just developed this living constitutionalist tradition. That's the descriptive part. And then the normative part is how within this tradition people ought to go forward. Having drawn that distinction, I think you would have a wonderful platform for making what I take to be your principal contribution, which I would describe this way. In their descriptive theories, most living constitutionalists up to now have lacked an appropriate sense of historical constitutional tragedy and normative part. If they had acquired that sense of tragedy in their descriptive theories, they would be inspired to want to adjust their normative theories in light of the kind of fallibilism that Burke emphasized and that leads you to the kind of living constitutionalism that you want to embrace. That's it.
Okay, Mike.
Yes, sorry. I had a reaction to the reading, and I think you might say, oh well, it's a sort of idiosyncratic reaction, but so part of what I took from the description is, first of all, you're saying that living constitutionalists are not, at least some of the time, sufficiently appreciative of the importance of entrenchment. That's something that they can learn from originalists. And originalists need to recognize that, you know, the judges who are the originalists are still products of their time and are inevitably going to see things through the contemporary sensibilities. So I was just sort of thinking about that, and whether or not that's a sort of imperfect argument or an argument for originalism of an imperfect sort. If we allow people to be living constitutionalists, they'll be too much in favor of change. They won't be sufficiently appreciative of entrenchment. And if we ask them to be originalists, well, they're still going to want change because they're products of their time, but at least they'll be balanced by, they'll be anchored by their originalist theory. So even though people won't do what they're supposed to be doing, isn't this an argument for originalism because it'll get them to be more entrenched than they would be if you took them, you freed them from the mast and allowed them to be living constitutionalists.
Okay, there are 3 questions. And
okay, again, I'll try to be quick. So Nick, I think that this is really helpful. I do think, though, I don't want to overemphasize the central role of the judiciary. Because I don't think the judiciary is driving. I think the judiciary is reflecting in this period. And so I'm particularly interested in thinking about constitutional entrenchment as it bears on the other actors. So for instance, why didn't Congress feel more of a constitutional obligation to disqualify Southern congressmen based on Section 2 of the 14th Amendment when the Southern states were clearly not complying with it? Right? Why didn't the president feel more of an affirmative obligation to intervene militarily when the rule of law was being flouted, when these constitutional amendments were being flouted? And so I think we need to think about constitutional entrenchment in the political branches, right? The sense that why don't political actors feel more of an obligation to comply? And I think part of the problem is that political branch actors feel some obligation not to do things that are unconstitutional. But when we start talking about affirmative obligations, like disqualifying the Southern congressmen or sending more troops into the South, that I think is a harder thing, right? And to build up a constitutional culture where a president would just see it as obligatory to intervene in Mississippi in 1875, that's, I think, the sort of thing that we need to get to, and that is hard to do. So Dick, I am just going to say your suggestions are always helpful, and these are, I think, are wonderful, and I will certainly take both of them on board, and that will save a lot of time. And then Mike, I think you're absolutely right that an originalist judge is going to be a little more inoculated against being swept along by the tide than someone who is an avowedly living constitutionalist judge and who thinks that legitimately they should be taking the temperature of social mores and political change at the time. I just don't think it's anywhere near enough. I mean, I do think, and I said at the outset, that living constitutionalism needs to be more like originalism, and that it absorbs some of originalism's focus on entrenchment for exactly the reason that you suggest. But I just don't think any tweak of interpretive methodology is going to be anywhere near enough to deal with the sort of forces that we're talking about. That's it.
Okay, we have 7 minutes to go. We'll hear next from questions from David Upham, Tom Colby, and Larry Solon.
Thank you very much for the paper, and I'm going to be as brief as I can. Strongly urge, based upon what people have said, a turn to the 15th instead of the 14th Amendment as an illustration for these reasons. Its meaning is far less debated, and therefore its nullification is less difficult to ascertain. Maybe 4 reasons. Second, its nullification is explicitly discussed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by scholars. And more provocatively, some of them, I did a research on this, some of them openly discuss living constitutionalism or organic development as a justification or an explanation of the nullification of the 15th Amendment, that paper says one thing, but society says another, and we have to go with society. Third, unlike the nullification of the Equal Protection Clause by the Reign of Terror, the nullification of the 15th was partly ratified by and given given legitimacy by judicial decisions, as well as by some academics at the time. And fourth, unlike sort of the question of desegregation of schools, the nullification of the 15th Amendment has there's zero evidence of any kind of Black support for that, whereas desegregation of schools is a little more complicated. But the nullification of the 15th was uniformly repudiated by African Americans, as far as I can tell at the time. Thanks.
Tom.
Okay, Ernie, great paper, love it. I do want to associate myself with some of what Jamal and Eric said about the notion that, in my mind, the story you tell is not so much a story of living constitutionalism as it is a story of anti-constitutionalism. But the point I wanted to make was, I very much appreciate the point that constitutional evolution is a two-way street, that one can't always assume that it's going to go in a leftward direction, a point I try to make to my students. I also very much appreciate your point that, originalism would not necessarily have saved us from some of the developments that you talk about, nor would it necessarily have brought us to the moral developments of Brown and other things. That's another point I've been making for many years. The 14th Amendment's original meaning is so open-ended that a commitment to interpreting it in an originalist manner is not actually particularly constraining on judges. But in that regard, then I wonder then whether it might be worth giving another lesson sort of explicitly as a takeaway at the end of your project, that not only should we be more Burkean in our constitutionalism, whatever form that takes, but also we should be a little bit more concrete in our textual amendments. We should write provisions that have a more determinate original meaning. It's not just our jurisprudence that ought to be more anchor and less sail. We should ask the same of our constitutional text itself. If we're going to amend the Constitution in the future, we need more 2 senators for state and less privileges or immunities. Because that way, whether you're an originalist or even a non-originalist, there's just less room for constitutional drift. There is more entrenchment inherent in concrete text. And then obviously the problem with that is, 1, it's hard to get supermajority agreement on concrete text, and 2, that raises dead hand problems that would have to be wrestled with, that push some of us away from originalism in the first place. But a thought.
Okay, and Larry.
Thank you. So 2 things. Number 1, I think you're missing a lot of recent literature on the Reconstruction, Ernie, and I would in particular urge you to take into account Pam Brandwine's Rethinking the Judicial Settlement of Reconstruction. Given your topic, I think you have to discuss that, her argument, in a substantive way. Second thing, I think that the paper is insufficiently attentive to the radical differences among different forms
of living constitutionalism. So you're trying to sort of see a common thread. I don't think there is that kind of a common thread. The Thayerians who argue against judicial review have really nothing in common with David Strauss's version of common law constitutionalism. And I'd say one more thing about this, which is that I think that the form of living constitutionalism that's gaining momentum right now is not a commitment to some neutral method. It is an explicit position that the Constitution should be interpreted to achieve a particular political program, and that the only mechanism of entrenchment is to gain control of the Senate and the presidency and appoint Supreme Court justices who share that particular political vision. You know, and of course, this same group would say that's what originalism is too. But I think that sort of the neutral sounding academic theories are much less important now than they were, say, 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
So Ernest,
So I can do these pretty quickly, I think, just because I think I'll agree with most of them. So David, that's very helpful. I guess it could be the lost years of the Reconstruction amendments, and that would work pretty well. And you know, the original lecture I was recruited to do this project for was on the 14th Amendment explicitly. So I had to sneak 15 in there, but emphasizing 15 would allow me to not be late for the sesquicentennial. So that sounds like a bonus. Tom, you know, great points. This question about concrete, I think there's no doubt that a concrete provision is more entrenched, but it makes me nervous for the same reason that I'm a living constitutionalist. I mean, I have always thought, you know, with Burke, that one generation cannot anticipate everything that's going to come along, that language is too imprecise to anticipate everything that's going to come along. And so these are the reasons that I'm not an originalist. And so it's hard to say that we should just be really, really specific. And you wonder, you know, how much it actually helps. I always start my con law class, you know, by having them read the Constitution and then talking about whether it should be more detailed. I give them the example of the EU Constitutional Treaty, which clocked in at about 350 pages because it was trying to be in that civil law tradition of being much more specific. But I think, you know, they have some of the same kinds of fights, and maybe that's one reason it wasn't adopted, because it was just too unwieldy and incomprehensible. Larry, I think, you know, I have the Brandwine book. I have a large to read stack. There's been some writing on these topics, and I'm trying to get through them as quick as I can. I'm not sure I'll live long enough to read everything in my to read stack, but that's you know, yeah, that looks like a good one. The point about that there are other quite different living constitutionalists is not something I thought of to think of, for instance, Thayer, but I can see why you say that, and that sounds really interesting. I think there is something to be said, though, if the Thayer living constitutionalists are that the Constitution lives and is shaped by the freedom of the political branches to do anything that's not a clear mistake, then these political branch decisions, you know, not to send in troops, not to invoke Section 2, become even more critical, right? And the idea of trying to build up a culture of constitutional entrenchment that's going to bear on the political branches as well, and especially the affirmative obligations of the political branches, I think just becomes even more imperative. So that's really, really helpful.